Stray dog barked every night at the mansion, until the gardener discovered the reason. Michael Johnson was starting to lose sleep because of that stray dog that showed up every night on the property where he had worked as a gardener for 15 years. The animal arrived promptly at 9 in the evening and barked non-stop toward the second-floor window of the mansion, the one that was always closed. It was when the situation became unbearable that his employer, Mrs. Margaret, a 70-year-old widowed businesswoman, completely lost her patience. "Michael Johnson, how many times do I have to repeat myself?" she said, slamming her fist on the porch table. "I want that dog off my property. I can't take this barking every night." The gardener scratched his head under the blue cap he always wore for work. He was a simple man, 45 years old, who had spent most of his adult life tending to those gardens in New York City, in the upscale Upper East Side neighborhood. "Mrs. Margaret, I've tried to shoo the little guy away several times, but he always comes back. It's like he has some connection to this house." "Connection?" She laughed sarcastically. "It's just some stray looking for food. Use a hose, throw rocks, do whatever it takes, but get that animal out of here." That night, Michael Johnson decided to observe the dog's behavior more closely. He hid behind the tall royal palms that decorated the front garden and waited. Right at 9 o'clock, as it had for the past 3 months, the dog appeared. It was a medium-sized dog, with brown and black fur, floppy ears, and an expression that seemed to carry deep sadness. What struck the gardener most was the way the animal behaved. It didn't bark aggressively or randomly. There was something almost human in its posture, as if it were trying to communicate with someone specific. The dog always stood in the same spot in the garden, right beneath the second-floor window that remained permanently closed, and began barking while looking straight up. The barks were short and deliberate, almost like a code. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out as we're just starting. Now, back to the story. Michael Johnson noticed something else. The dog always carried the same object in its mouth when it arrived, a small worn-out teddy bear, its color faded with time. The animal carefully placed the toy in the bed of white roses before starting its nightly barking ritual. Curious, the gardener decided to approach. To his surprise, the dog didn't run away or show aggression. On the contrary, when it saw Michael Johnson, it stopped barking and stared at him with those brown eyes full of a melancholy that deeply moved him. "What do you want, boy?" Michael whispered, slowly extending his hand. The dog sniffed his fingers and then looked back at the closed window, as if begging the gardener to understand something important. The next morning, Michael Johnson mentioned the incident to Martha, the housemaid who had worked at the mansion longer than he had, almost 20 years. "Martha, do you know why that second-floor window is always closed?" he asked while watering the begonias in the backyard garden. The 60-year-old woman stopped hanging clothes on the line and looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. "Michael Johnson, that's none of our business," she said quietly. "Mrs. Margaret doesn't like anyone talking about that room." "But you must know something, you've been here so long." Martha sighed and stepped closer to him. "That was her son's room, Timmy's. It's been closed for over 10 years. "Son?" Michael was stunned. "But Mrs. Margaret always told me she didn't have any children. It's because she doesn't like to remember. It was a very sad thing, Michael Johnson. The boy was only 8 years old when he passed." The gardener felt a chill in his stomach. He was beginning to understand why Mrs. Margaret was such a bitter and lonely woman. There was a deep pain hidden behind all that harshness. "What was he like?" he asked gently. "A beautiful boy, Michael Johnson. Curly hair, a big smile. He loved animals, especially dogs. He was always begging his mother to let him have one, but Mrs. Margaret always said no." This information made Michael Johnson's heart race. Could there be a connection between the stray dog and the boy who had lived in that room? That afternoon, when Mrs. Margaret left for her business meetings, Michael Johnson decided to investigate further. He walked to the part of the house where the mysterious window was. From the outside, he could see the curtains had been drawn for a long time, covered in dust. "Martha," he called the maid as she passed by, "do you have the key to that room?" "Michael Johnson, this is madness. Mrs. Margaret would kill me if she knew I went in there. Please, Martha, I just want to take a quick look. I think it might have something to do with the dog that shows up every night. The maid fell silent for a few minutes, clearly torn between curiosity and fear of upsetting her employer. "All right," she finally said, "but only for a few minutes, and you can't touch anything." Timmy's room was exactly as he had left it over a decade ago. A single bed with Spider-Man sheets, shelves full of toy cars and action figures, and on the small corner table several colorful drawings stuck to the wall. Michael Johnson was moved by the sight of this preserved space. It was like a shrine to the memory of a mother who couldn't say goodbye to her son. But what caught his attention the most was one specific drawing on the wall. A boy with curly hair next to a brown and black dog, looking very much like the stray that appeared in the garden. Underneath the drawing, in a child's handwriting, it read, "Me and my friend Duke." "Martha," Michael Johnson called, pointing to the drawing. "Did Timmy have a dog?" "No, never. Mrs. Margaret wouldn't allow it, but he always talked about a dog he'd see on the street when he came home from school. Said it was his special friend." "What do you mean?" "The boy would always come home telling stories about this dog he met on his way. Said the animal would follow him home and wait outside. Mrs. Margaret thought it was just a child's imagination." Michael Johnson felt a shiver. Could the dog that appeared every night be the same one the boy had drawn? But that would be impossible. Over 10 years had passed. That night, he decided to observe the dog more closely. When the animal arrived promptly at 9, Michael Johnson was waiting with a small flashlight. "Hey, boy," he said softly, crouching near the dog. To his surprise, the dog came to him, wagging its tail timidly. Michael Johnson could see it was well cared for. It didn't look like a stray. Someone clearly fed and looked after it. "Where do you come from, huh?" he asked, petting the dog's head. The dog barked once, as if answering, then turned its gaze back to the closed window. Michael Johnson followed its gaze and in that moment had a hunch. What if the dog belonged to someone who had known Timmy? The next morning, he decided to investigate the neighborhood. He started by asking long-time neighbors if they recognized the dog. Mrs. Dorothy, an 80-year-old woman who had lived next door for 40 years, gave him the first important clue. "Oh, I know that dog," she said, adjusting her glasses. "It belongs to old Mr. Wilson, who lives down the back street. But it's strange because Duke doesn't usually leave the house alone." "Duke!" Michael Johnson felt his heart race. It was the same name as Timmy's cartoon. "Yes, that's his name. Old Mr. Wilson has had him for many years. He says the dog showed up at his doorstep as a puppy, around the same time that tragedy happened at Mrs. Margaret's house." Michael Johnson thanked them and immediately headed to old Mr. Wilson's house. It was a simple but well-kept home with a small garden in front. A thin man, about 70 years old, was watering some plants when Michael approached. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. I'm the gardener from Mrs. Margaret's house on the back street." The man stopped what he was doing and stared at him with an expression Michael couldn't decipher. "Ah, you must be talking about Duke. He's been very restless lately." "Do you know why he goes there every night?" "Mr." Wilson let out a deep sigh and motioned for Michael to sit on a bench on the porch. "It's a sad story, young man. Duke was Timmy's dog, Mrs. Margaret's boy. But the maid told me he never had a dog. Officially, no. But in practice, that dog belonged to the boy. When Duke was a puppy, he kept running away to play with Timmy on his way to school. The two became inseparable." Michael felt he was getting closer to unraveling the mystery. And what happened? When Timmy passed, Duke was inconsolable. He spent days at Mrs. Margaret's gate waiting for the boy to return. She didn't want to keep the dog, said it was too painful. That's when I decided to adopt Duke. "And why did he start going back there now?" Mr. Wilson scratched his gray beard. "I'm not sure. It started about 3 months ago. Suddenly Duke became restless, as if he'd sensed something. One night he managed to escape, and when I went looking for him, he was in front of Mrs. Margaret's house, barking at Timmy's bedroom window. The story was becoming more and more intriguing for Michael, but also more confusing. Why, after all this time, had the dog returned to that behavior? "Mr. Wilson, do you have any idea what might have changed 3 months ago?" The man thought for a moment. "Well, it was around the time I found that stuffed bear in the park. Duke got very worked up when he saw it. as if he recognized it. Ever since, he's been carrying that bear everywhere. Michael felt a chill. It was the same stuffed bear the dog brought to the mansion's garden every night. Could you tell me how you met Timmy? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing, Mr. Wilson settled into his chair as if preparing for a long story. I used to work as a bus driver on the route near Timmy's school. Every day I'd see that boy getting off the school bus, always alone, always with a somewhat sad expression. Why sad? His mother was very strict, you know. Mrs. Margaret was always very focused on business, very serious. The boy seemed starved for affection. That's when Duke, still a puppy, started following Timmy. How so? The dog showed up at my house on a rainy afternoon, wet and hungry. I took him in, but the next day he disappeared. When I went looking, I found him playing with Timmy in the park. Michael was fascinated by the story. And did Mrs. Margaret know about this friendship? At first, no. Timmy hid it from his mother. He'd come to my house after school to play with Duke before heading home. I allowed it because I saw how happy it made the boy. And then, one day, Mrs. Margaret found out. She was furious. Said she didn't want her son getting involved with street animals, that he could catch diseases. She forbade Timmy from playing with Duke. Old Mr. Wilson's voice trembled, but the boy disobeyed. He kept sneaking over here until one day, the man stopped speaking, clearly emotional. What happened, Mr. Wilson? It was on a rainy afternoon, just like the day I found Duke. Timmy had fought with his mother because she discovered he was still coming to play with the dog. He left the house very upset and ran over here. Michael Johnson waited patiently for the man to continue. We played a bit in the backyard, but the rain was too heavy. I told him to go home, that his mother would be worried. He left with Duke, who always walked him to the mansion's gate. And then? That was the last time I saw Timmy. The next day I found out that he was no longer here with us. Michael Johnson felt a pang in his chest. He was starting to understand the deep pain Mrs. Margaret carried. Duke came back home alone that night, soaked and very agitated. I knew something had happened, but I only found out what it was the next day. How did it happen? No one knows for sure. They found the boy in the creek behind the mansion. Seems he slipped in the mud and hit his head on a rock. The rain was very heavy that day. Michael Johnson stayed silent for a few minutes, absorbing all that tragic information. And Mrs. Margaret? She was devastated, never the same again. She completely shut herself away, locked the boy's room, and forbade anyone from speaking about it. When I offered to let her keep Duke, she refused, said it was too painful. And the dog? Duke was depressed for months, wouldn't eat properly, wouldn't play, spent whole days staring at Timmy's bedroom window. It was a very hard time for both of us. Michael Johnson was starting to piece the puzzle together. Mr. Wilson, you said Duke started this behavior again 3 months ago, right? Yes, exactly. Do you know what happened 3 months ago that might have changed something? The man thought again. Well, it was when Mrs. Margaret returned from a long trip. She'd been away almost 6 months handling business overseas. When she came back, she seemed different, more worn down. This intrigued Michael Johnson. Maybe there was a connection between Mrs. Margaret's return and Duke's behavior. Do you think the dog could have sensed she was back? It's possible. Animals have a strong sensitivity to these things. Maybe Duke noticed she was going through a hard time. Michael Johnson thanked Mr. Wilson for the information and returned to the mansion, his mind racing with thoughts. Now he understood why the dog always barked at Timmy's bedroom window. Duke was trying to communicate with the memory of his best friend, but there was still one puzzle piece that didn't fit. Why now? What had changed 3 months ago to make the dog resume this behavior? That afternoon, Michael Johnson decided to talk to Martha more deeply about Mrs. Margaret's return from the trip. Martha, how was Mrs. Margaret when she came back from the trip? The maid looked around to make sure they were alone. Very worn down, Michael Johnson, more than I'd ever seen. It was like she'd aged 10 years in those 6 months away. Did she say anything about the trip? Not much. Only that she hadn't been able to solve the problem she went to fix over there. But one strange thing happened the first week she was back. What? She went up to Timmy's room. First time in 10 years I'd seen her do that. Stayed in there for over an hour. Michael Johnson felt he was getting close to something important. And then? Then she came down crying hard, said she needed to find a way to forgive herself for what happened to the boy. Forgive herself. Michael, I think Mrs. Margaret blames herself for Timmy's departure. That day they'd fought over the dog. She said harsh things to the boy, and he left the house upset. Now everything was making sense to Michael Johnson. Mrs. Margaret carried the guilt of having fought with her son on the last day she saw him, and Duke somehow had sensed she was going through a moment of deep emotional pain. That night, Michael Johnson decided to try an experiment. When Duke arrived for his nightly ritual, instead of just watching, he approached the dog and said aloud, "Duke, I know you miss Timmy. I wish I'd known him too." The dog stopped barking immediately and stared at him with an almost human expression of understanding. "You want to help Mrs. Margaret, don't you? You want her to know Timmy isn't mad at her?" Duke wagged his tail and walked over to where he'd left the stuffed bear. He gently picked up the toy in his mouth and brought it to Michael Johnson. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. At that moment, Michael Johnson had an idea. Maybe it was time for Mrs. Margaret to know the whole truth about her son's friendship with Duke. Maybe it could help her find some peace. The next day, he sought out Martha again. "Martha, I need to talk to Mrs. Margaret about the dog, but I need your help." "Michael, that's dangerous. She doesn't like talking about Timmy." "I know, but I think it might help her. I've discovered important things about the connection between Duke and the boy." Martha grew thoughtful. "What did you find out?" Michael Johnson told her the whole story he'd learned from old Mr. Wilson. The housekeeper was moved, hearing the details of the boy and dog's friendship. "My goodness, Michael. Timmy never told me about that. He was always so private." "Martha, I think Mrs. Margaret needs to know her son wasn't alone in his final moments, that he had a friend who truly loved him." "But how will you bring it up with her?" "I need the right moment. When she's calmer, less defensive. She always has tea on the back porch in the afternoon reading company reports. Maybe that would be a good time." Michael Johnson spent the morning rehearsing in his mind how to approach the subject. He knew he needed to be very delicate. Mrs. Margaret had built strong emotional walls around this pain. Around 4 in the afternoon, he approached the porch where Mrs. Margaret was having her daily tea. "Mrs. Margaret, may I speak with you for a moment?" She looked up from her papers impatiently. "If it's about the dog again, Michael, I've said I don't want to hear it. It is about him, but I think you'd want to know what I've discovered." "I'm not interested." "Mrs. Margaret, the dog's name is Duke. He belonged to Timmy." The woman froze, her teacup suspended in midair. "What did you say?" "Duke was your son's best friend, Mrs. Margaret. They met over 10 years ago and played together every day after school." Mrs. Margaret set down the cup with trembling hands. "That's impossible. My son never had a dog." "Not officially, but in practice he did. Timmy went to old Mr. Wilson's house every day. He lives on the back street, to play with Duke." "Old Mr. Wilson?" "The retired bus driver who adopted Duke as a puppy. He told me the whole story of their friendship." Mrs. Margaret rose from her chair, clearly agitated. "Why are you telling me this, Michael Johnson?" "Because I think you should know that Timmy wasn't alone that last day. Duke was with him, and now he comes back here every night because he senses you're suffering." Mrs. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand, Michael Johnson. I fought with my son that day. I said terrible things. He left the house crying because of me. Mrs. Margaret, I know all about that. But old Mr. Wilson told me Timmy wasn't angry with you. He was sad, but not angry. And Duke can prove it." "How so?" "Every night he brings a stuffed bear and leaves it in the garden before barking at the window. It's a gift for Timmy. Duke still believes the boy is in that room waiting." Mrs. Margaret collapsed into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "I don't deserve forgiveness, Michael Johnson. I was a terrible mother. I was always focused on work, never giving my son the attention he needed." Mrs. Margaret, What if you spoke with old Mr. Wilson? He could tell you so many stories about how happy Timmy was when he played with Duke. I don't know if I have the courage. I can arrange a meeting right here at the mansion. You don't even have to leave the house. Mrs. Margaret fell silent for several minutes, wrestling with her emotions. All right, she finally said, but I want you there too. The next day, Michael Johnson invited old Mr. Wilson to the mansion. The man was nervous about seeing Mrs. Margaret after so many years, but he agreed when he heard it might help her. The meeting was set for that afternoon on the same porch where Mrs. Margaret used to have tea. Michael Johnson prepared the space with comfortable chairs and asked Martha to serve coffee. When old Mr. Wilson arrived, he was visibly emotional, carrying a shoebox under his arm. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Margaret," he said timidly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. Please sit." The first few minutes were awkward, neither knowing quite how to start the conversation. It was Michael Johnson who broke the ice. "Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Margaret would like to hear about Timmy and Duke's friendship." The man took a deep breath and began speaking fondly about the afternoons he spent watching the boy play with the dog in his backyard. "Mrs. Margaret, I've never seen a purer friendship than theirs. Timmy talked to Duke like he was a person. He told him about his troubles at school, about his dreams." "What kind of dreams, Mrs. Kind?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "He wanted to be a vet when he grew up, said he'd take care of all the abandoned animals in the world, and he always spoke of you with so much love." "That can't be true. We fought all the time." "Maybe so, but he loved you dearly. He always said his mother was the bravest woman he knew, that one day he wanted to be just like you." Mrs. Margaret couldn't stop crying. "Mr. Wilson, do you think my son would forgive me?" "Mrs. Margaret, children don't hold grudges, especially against their mothers. Timmy knew you worked so hard because you wanted the best for him. But I should have given him more attention, more affection. You gave what you could at the time. Don't blame yourself." Old Mr. Wilson opened the shoebox he had brought. "Mrs. Margaret, I brought a few things that belonged to Timmy, things he left at my house." Inside the box were drawings the boy had made of Duke, a small leash he had crafted from string, and a letter. He wrote this letter a few days before that awful day, said to give it to you if anything ever happened to him. With shaking hands, Mrs. Margaret took the letter. It was written in Timmy's childish handwriting. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to say it in person. I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm not mad at you because of Duke. I know you work hard to take care of me, and I understand why you didn't want me to have a dog. But Duke is my best friend, and I hope one day you can like him too. Take care of yourself, Mom, and if you feel sad, remember I'll always be watching over you. Love, your son, Timmy." Mrs. Margaret broke down in tears. It was as if a 10-year emotional dam had burst all at once. "How did he know?" she whispered between sobs. "Children are wiser than we think," said old Mr. Wilson. "They sense things we adults can't even notice." Michael Johnson stepped closer and placed a hand on Mrs. Margaret's shoulder. "Mrs. Margaret, Duke keeps coming here because he feels you need comfort. He wants to keep the promise he made to Timmy, to take care of you." "I don't deserve this love," she said. "Yes, you do. Everyone deserves a second chance to be happy." At that moment, as if summoned, Duke appeared in the garden. It wasn't his usual time to show up, but there he was, carrying the stuffed bear in his mouth. Old Mr. Wilson stood up. "Duke, come here, boy." The dog ran over and stopped in front of Mrs. Margaret, placing the bear at her feet. For the first time in 10 years, Mrs. Margaret touched an animal. She reached out and stroked Duke's head. "Hello, Duke," she said, her voice trembling. "Finally we meet." The dog wagged his tail and rested his head on her lap, as if he understood the importance of that moment perfectly. "Mr. Wilson," Mrs. Margaret said, still petting Duke, "I'd like to make a proposal." "What proposal?" "I want Duke to come live here with me. If you'll allow it, of course." The man was surprised. "Mrs. Margaret, Duke is already old. He's almost 11. He might be a handful." "I don't mind. I have 10 years of overdue love to make up to him." Old Mr. Wilson looked at the dog, who seemed to understand the conversation perfectly. "I think Duke would like that. He always wanted to come back home. This was always his home, Mrs. Margaret said. I was just too foolish to see it. And so, Duke finally came home. Mrs. Margaret had Timmy's room completely renovated, turning it into a special suite for the dog, while keeping some original elements like the drawings on the wall and the boy's bed. The stuffed bear was placed in a place of honor on the shelf, and every night, Duke slept beside the bed where his best friend used to sleep. But the story didn't end there. A few days after Duke moved into the mansion, Mrs. Margaret made a discovery that would change everything again. She was organizing Timmy's belongings when she found a hidden diary under the mattress, one she had never seen before. With a racing heart, she began reading her son's notes. The first pages talked about school, friends, and games. But as she read further, she uncovered things that left her in shock. Timmy wrote about a secret he had kept for months. Apparently, he had found some important papers belonging to Mrs. Margaret that revealed information about the company's financial situation. According to the diary, the boy had discovered that Mrs. Margaret was going through serious financial trouble. The company was nearly bankrupt, and she was fighting desperately to save the business she had built her entire life. Timmy wrote that he understood why his mom was always so worried and working so much. He wanted to help, but didn't know how. That was when he got the idea to save all his allowance to help her. In the final pages of the diary, the boy mentioned he had managed to save a considerable amount of money hidden in a secret spot. He was planning to give it to Mrs. Margaret as a birthday surprise. Mrs. Margaret couldn't believe what she was reading. Her son, at just 8 years old, already showed impressive emotional maturity and unconditional love for her. But where could this money be hidden? The diary didn't specify the exact location, only saying it was in the place where Duke and I used to play when it rained. Intrigued, Mrs. Margaret called Michael Johnson and old Mr. Wilson to help her figure out where this secret spot might be. Mr. Wilson, where did Timmy and Duke play when it rained? The man thought for a few minutes. When it rained hard, they stayed in my garage. There was a little corner where Timmy kept some toys. Can we go check there? Of course, Mrs. Margaret, but it's been so many years. If there was anything there, it's probably gone by now. The three of them went to Mr. Wilson's house, accompanied by Duke, who grew very excited revisiting his old home. In the garage, in a dusty corner, there was an old cardboard box, somewhat worn by time. Inside, along with a few old toys, was a plastic envelope. With trembling hands, Mrs. Margaret opened it. Inside were several bills carefully stored and a note. For my dear mother, this money is to help you with the company's troubles. I know you're worried, but you don't have to be. I love you and we'll get through everything together. Your loving son, Timmy. Mrs. Margaret broke down in tears once again. Her son's generosity and love touched her deeply, even after all these years. How old was Timmy when he wrote this? She asked Mr. Wilson. He was 8, Mrs. Margaret, but he was a very special child, very sensitive to others' feelings. I never knew he noticed my financial struggles. I tried to hide everything from him. Children notice more than we think, said Michael Johnson. They may not fully understand, but they sense when their parents are worried. Mrs. Margaret looked at Duke, who was lying calmly beside the box where Timmy's treasure had been found. Duke, you knew about this secret, didn't you? She said, stroking the dog. You've been keeping this for me all these years. The dog wagged his tail, as if confirming. That night, back at the mansion, Mrs. Margaret had an idea. She wanted to honor her son's memory in a special way, using the money exactly as he had intended. The next day, she sought out Michael Johnson. Michael, I want to create a social project in Timmy's honor. Something related to caring for abandoned animals, since that was his dream. What kind of project, Mrs. Margaret? I'll turn part of the mansion's gardens into a shelter for abandoned dogs, and I'll use the money Timmy saved as the starting capital. The idea moved the gardener deeply. I think he'd be very proud, Mrs. Margaret. And I want you to oversee the shelter's garden area. You have a good heart and know a lot about plants and animals. Michael Johnson was speechless. It was an incredible opportunity to do something meaningful in memory of a boy he'd never met, but had come to love through the stories he'd heard. It would be an honor, Mrs. Margaret. And Mr. Wilson can help care for the animals. He has experience, and Duke can serve as an example of how well dogs can be treated. The Timmy and Duke Shelter project began taking shape in the following weeks. Mrs. Margaret invested not only the money her son had saved, but also a considerable portion of her own resources. Michael Johnson dedicated himself to creating a wonderful space in the mansion's gardens. He built cozy little houses for the dogs, a small pond for them to play in, and planted several fruit trees that would provide shade and food. Old Mr. Wilson became the shelter's official caretaker, and Duke took on the role of guide dog, helping new animals adjust to the place. Martha also got involved in the project, cooking special meals for the dogs and helping care for the puppies that arrived at the shelter. But the most transformative thing of all was the effect the project had on Mrs. Margaret. For the first time in 10 years, she smiled genuinely. Caring for abandoned animals made her feel like she was fulfilling the dream her son never got to realize. The shelter quickly gained recognition in the neighborhood and began receiving donations from other residents. Families came to adopt the dogs, and Mrs. Margaret made sure to personally meet each new home to ensure the animals would be well treated. One day a family came to the shelter looking for a dog to adopt. It was a single mother and her 8-year-old son, the exact age Timmy had been when he passed. The boy's name was Jake, and he was enchanted by all the dogs, but especially by a mixed-breed female who had arrived at the shelter the week before. "Can I play with her?" he asked Mrs. Margaret. "Of course, sweetheart. Her name is Hope." Jake played with the dog for almost an hour, and the connection between them was clear. "Mom, can I keep her? Please," he begged his mother. The woman, whose name was Susan, talked with Mrs. Margaret about the responsibilities of having a pet. "Mrs. Margaret, I work a lot, and I'm afraid I won't be able to take good care of Hope." "Susan, how about this? Jake can take Hope home, but you can always come back to the shelter whenever you need help, or if you'd like her to play with other dogs." "Is that really possible?" "Of course, this is a family. Once you adopt one of our animals, you're part of this family too." Jake jumped for joy and hugged Mrs. Margaret. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret. I'll take really good care of Hope." At that moment, Mrs. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the warmth of being called aunt by a child. It was as if Timmy was speaking through that boy. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. As the months passed, the shelter became a gathering place for the whole community. Children came to play with the dogs after school. Seniors found companionship in the calmer animals, and families discovered new members for their homes. Mrs. Margaret was completely transformed. The bitter, lonely woman gave way to a warm and welcoming person, always ready to help both the animals and the people who came to the shelter. Michael Johnson also grew a lot through the experience. Beyond tending the gardens, he began studying veterinary medicine in night classes, inspired by Timmy's dream. "Mrs. Margaret," he said one day, "I want to become a veterinarian. I think I can help the shelter's animals even more." "Michael, I'll pay for your studies. It's the least I can do for everything you've done for me and for Timmy." "You don't have to, Mrs. Margaret. Please, let me do this. It's a way to honor my son's dream." And so Michael Johnson began his new academic journey, always with Mrs. Margaret's support and the loyal companionship of Duke, who never had to bark alone at the window again. Old Mr. Wilson became a father figure to many neighborhood children who visited the shelter. He told stories about Timmy and Duke, keeping alive the memory of the special friendship that had inspired it all. "Mr. Wilson," Jake asked one day, "was Timmy like me?" "Very much so, young man. You both share the same love for animals and the same generous heart. I wish I could have met him." "You do know him, Jake. Every time you care for Hope with tenderness, every time you help an animal in need, you're getting to know Timmy." Because that's exactly how he would act. But life had one more emotional surprise in store for Mrs. Margaret. A year after the shelter opened, she received an unexpected call. It was from a woman who introduced herself as the director of a veterinary school in New York City. "Mrs. Margaret, we've heard about the wonderful work you're doing with the Timmy and Duke shelter. We'd like to propose a partnership. What kind of partnership? Our students could intern at the shelter, caring for the animals and learning hands-on. In return, we'd provide free veterinary care for all the dogs at the shelter. Mrs. Margaret was moved. It was as if the universe was conspiring to fulfill all the dreams Timmy had nurtured. That would be wonderful. When can we start? The partnership with the veterinary school brought a new dimension to the shelter. Young students came regularly to care for the animals, and Mrs. Margaret delighted in seeing their enthusiasm. Among the interns was a young woman named Amanda, 22 years old, who showed a special passion for abandoned animals. "Mrs. Margaret," she said one day, "I'd love to hear the story of the boy who inspired this shelter." Mrs. Margaret, who once avoided talking about Timmy, now took pleasure in sharing memories of her son. "Timmy was a very special child, Amanda. He was only 8, but he already dreamed of becoming a vet to care for all the abandoned animals in the world." What a beautiful dream, and did he know Duke? They were best friends. Duke was the dog my son could never officially have, but who loved him unconditionally. Amanda looked at Duke, now 12 years old and slower, but still tenderly overseeing all the other animals at the shelter. "Can I ask you something personal, Mrs. Margaret?" "Of course." "Don't you think Timmy would be proud to see all this?" Mrs. Margaret smiled with tears in her eyes. "I feel like he's here with us, Amanda. Every time we save an animal, every time a family finds a new member, I feel his presence. And Duke, how is he handling his age?" "Duke is happy. He's finally home, surrounded by love, fulfilling the mission Timmy gave him, to take care of me and other animals in need." That night, Mrs. Margaret had a vivid dream about Timmy. In the dream, he was playing in the shelter's garden with dozens of dogs, all happy and well cared for. "Mom," he said in the dream, "thank you for making my dream come true. I'm the one who should thank you, my son. You taught me the true meaning of love." "Is Duke okay?" "Yes, he is. He's the king of the shelter. All the other dogs respect and love him." "Mom, I was never angry with you. I always knew you loved me." "I know that now, Timmy, and I promise I'll keep taking care of Duke and all the animals who need us." When she woke up, Mrs. Margaret felt at peace for the first time in over 10 years. It was as if she had finally received the forgiveness she'd longed for. The shelter continued to grow and thrive. Mrs. Margaret created educational programs for schools where children came to learn about animal care and responsibility. Jake, who had adopted Hope, became one of the shelter's most dedicated volunteers, even though he was still a child. "Aunt Margaret," he said one day, "when I grow up, I want to be a vet, just like Timmy wanted to be." "I'm sure you'll be a wonderful vet, Jake, and Timmy would be so happy to know he inspired you." Michael Johnson was almost done with veterinary school and already planning to open his own clinic in partnership with the shelter. "Mrs. Margaret, when I graduate, I want my clinic to be right next to the shelter. That way I can take care of not just our animals, but all the pets in the neighborhood too." "Michael Johnson, you amaze me more every day. Timmy chose the right person to be our gardener." Old Mr. Wilson, even in his 70s, remained active and dedicated to the shelter. He had become the official storyteller of Timmy and Duke's tales for every child who visited. Martha discovered she had a special talent for caring for orphaned puppies and became the official foster mom for every baby that arrived at the shelter. And Duke remained the heart of the shelter. Even slower with age, he still made sure to personally greet every new animal as if welcoming them on Timmy's behalf. One day, 2 years after the shelter opened, a special situation tested the strength of the family they had built. Duke began showing signs that his advanced age was taking its toll. He was more tired, eating less, and spending long hours sleeping. Michael Johnson, now almost a vet, examined him gently. "Mrs. Margaret, Duke is entering the final stage of his life. There's nothing specifically wrong. It's just his time." "How long does he have?" "It's hard to say. Could be months, could be weeks. The important thing is that he's comfortable and surrounded by love." Mrs. Margaret made a decision. She changed her own routine to spend more time with Duke, cherishing every moment they had left. "Duke," she said, stroking him as they sat in the garden, Thank you for everything you've done for me and for Timmy. You're the most loyal friend anyone could ask for." Duke lifted his head and looked at her with those warm brown eyes, still bright with intelligence and love. The whole shelter team came together to make Duke's final days as special as possible. Everyone touched by his story came to pay tribute. Jake brought Hope to play with him. Amanda, the vet student, spent afternoons singing to him. Old Mr. Wilson told stories about Duke and Timmy's friendship. "Duke," Jake whispered, petting him, "thank you for teaching me how to love animals. When I become a vet, I'll always remember you and Timmy." On a quiet Sunday morning, Duke didn't get up for his usual walk through the gardens. Mrs. Margaret knew immediately something was different. "Duke, my dear friend," she whispered, kneeling beside him, "is it time?" The dog looked at her with deep peace in his eyes, as if thanking her for all those years of love and care. Michael Johnson, Martha, old Mr. Wilson and Jake were all there. It was as if Duke had waited to say goodbye to his whole adopted family. "Duke," Mrs. Margaret said, holding his paw, "tell Timmy I finally understand the lesson you both came to teach me. Love never ends, it just changes." Duke closed his eyes for the last time, surrounded by the hands of everyone who loved him. His passing hit everyone at the shelter hard, especially Mrs. Margaret. It felt like she was losing her last physical connection to Timmy. But then something surprising happened. Instead of sinking back into grief, she felt stronger. Duke had fulfilled his mission on Earth. He had taught her to love again, to forgive herself, and to find purpose in life. "Michael Johnson," she said the next day, "I want to create a memorial for Duke here in the garden. A special place where people can come to remember him and Timmy." "What kind of memorial?" "A statue of the two of them playing together, just like they did when they were best friends." The memorial was created with the help of a local sculptor who was deeply moved by their story. The statue showed an 8-year-old boy running alongside a mixed-breed dog, both with expressions of pure joy. At the base of the statue, a plaque read, "Timmy and Duke, two friends who taught us that true love never dies, it only multiplies." The memorial became a pilgrimage site for people from all over the city who had been touched by their story. Families brought their children to learn about the love and friendship that had inspired the shelter. Jake, now 10 years old, had become the official guide for memorial visits. He knew every detail of the story and told it with a passion that reminded everyone of Timmy. "This is the story of the boy who dreamed of saving every animal in the world," he would say to groups of visitors, "and the dog who never gave up on the family he loved." Mrs. Margaret watched proudly as her son's story continued to inspire new generations. The shelter had become a national benchmark for abandoned animal care, welcoming visitors from across the country. Michael Johnson graduated as a veterinarian and opened his clinic next to the shelter, fulfilling the dream Timmy had planted in his heart. Amanda, the student who had fallen in love with the story, became Michael's veterinary partner, and together they developed innovative rehabilitation techniques for traumatized animals. Old Mr. Wilson, even in retirement, still came to the shelter every day to share stories and tend to the gardens with the same care he always had. Martha discovered her calling as a puppy caregiver and became a recognized specialist in neonatal care for orphan dogs. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation was Mrs. Margaret's. The woman who had spent 10 years living in guilt and loneliness had become a symbol of love and dedication to animals in need. "You know Michael Johnson," she said one day as they watched a group of children playing with the shelter dogs. "I used to think I had lost everything when Timmy passed, but now I understand he was never truly gone. He's present in every animal we save, in every smile of a child who adopts a dog, in every life we change." "And Duke is here too," said Michael Johnson. "Every time one of our dogs shows loyalty and unconditional love, I see Duke in them." 5 years had passed since Duke's departure. The Timmy and Duke shelter had become a respected institution, with branches in other cities and an adoption program that had found homes for over 1,000 animals. Mrs. Margaret, now 75, remained active and dedicated, but had started thinking about the shelter's future. "Michael Johnson, I want to make sure the shelter continues long after I'm gone." "Mrs. Margaret, don't talk like that. It's not sadness, it's planning. I want to create a foundation to ensure Timmy and Duke's work lives on forever. And so, the Timmy and Duke Foundation was born, a non-profit organization dedicated to rescuing, caring for, and finding homes for abandoned animals across the United States. Jake, now a 15-year-old teenager, had become the foundation's youth spokesperson, speaking at schools and events about the importance of caring for animals. "The story of Timmy and Duke taught me that age doesn't matter," he would say in his talks. "We can all make a difference in the life of an animal in need." One special afternoon, Mrs. Margaret received a visit that moved her deeply. It was Susan, Jake's mother, who came with a surprise. "Mrs. Margaret," Susan said, "I brought someone special to meet you." With her was an adult dog, clearly pregnant, whom Susan held gently by the leash. "This is Bella," Susan explained. "She's Hope's daughter, and she's expecting puppies." Mrs. Margaret was overcome with emotion. It was as if life was completing a perfect circle. "And you know what's even more special?" added Jake, who had arrived shortly after. "Bella is pregnant with a dog that looks just like Duke. Even though he's a mutt, he has the same colors and traits." "How do you know that?" "We did an ultrasound at Michael Johnson's clinic. One of the puppies looks exactly like Duke did when he was young." Mrs. Margaret felt indescribable emotion. It was as if Timmy and Duke were sending a gift from heaven. "Mrs. Margaret," Jake said, "when this puppy is born, we'd like to donate him to the shelter, so he can carry on Duke's mission." "You'd do that?" "Of course. This shelter is our second home, and we know this special puppy belongs here." A few weeks later, Bella gave birth to a litter of 5 puppies, and sure enough, one of them was practically identical to Duke. Same size, same colors, the same intelligent look in his eyes. "What should we name him?" Jake asked. Mrs. Margaret didn't hesitate. "Duke Jr. He'll carry the name and mission of our dear friend." And so, Duke Jr. arrived at the shelter, bringing new energy and hope to everyone. Even as a puppy, he showed the same intelligence and affection his predecessor had displayed. Michael Johnson, now an experienced and respected veterinarian, was fascinated by the puppy's traits. "Mrs. Margaret, it's amazing how this puppy behaves just like the original Duke. It's like there's a special connection." "I believe there is," she said, watching Duke Jr. play with the other shelter dogs. "Some bonds go beyond physical life." The shelter continued to grow and thrive. The story of Timmy and Duke had inspired a nationwide movement to care for abandoned animals, and Mrs. Margaret received invitations to speak at events across the country. "I never imagined," she said in one of her talks, "that the pain of losing a child could turn into so much love and hope for so many animals and families." Jake, now 17, had been accepted into veterinary school, following the dream Timmy had planted more than a decade earlier. "Aunt Margaret," he said the day he got his acceptance letter, "I promise to use everything I've learned here at the shelter to help even more animals." "Jake, you've already done more for animals than many adults do in a lifetime. Timmy would be so proud of you." Old Mr. Wilson, now nearly 80, remained the shelter's official historian, but had trained Jake to pass the stories on to future generations. "My boy," he told Jake, "the responsibility of keeping Timmy and Duke's memory alive is now yours too." "I understand, Mr. Wilson, and I promise I'll never let this story be forgotten." Martha had become the supervisor of all special care for puppies and injured animals, developing techniques studied in veterinary schools. "Who would have thought," she said to Mrs. Margaret one day, "that a dog barking at the window would change so much in our lives?" "Martha, sometimes the biggest transformations start with the simplest gestures." Duke knew exactly what he was doing when he came barking here every night. On one particularly emotional afternoon, Mrs. Margaret was in the garden watching Duke Jr. play with the visiting children when she had a profound revelation. "Michael Johnson," she called, "come here for a moment." "Of course, Mrs. Margaret." "Look at this scene. Happy children playing with well-cared-for dogs, families finding new members, young people learning about responsibility and love for animals. It's truly beautiful to see. This was Timmy's dream, Michael Johnson. Not just to care for abandoned animals, but to create a community where love for animals would bring people together. And look how we've managed to fulfill this dream. Not us, Michael Johnson. Timmy and Duke did. We were merely the instruments they used. At that moment, Duke Jr. came running over and sat at Mrs. Margaret's feet, looking up at her with the same expression of love and loyalty the original Duke had always shown. "Hello, my dear friend," she said, petting the dog. "Thank you for continuing to take care of all of us." And so the story that began with a dog barking at the window of a mansion became a legacy of love that touched thousands of lives and saved thousands of animals. The Timmy and Duke shelter kept growing, the Timmy and Duke Foundation expanded to other states, and the story of the boy who dreamed of saving all the animals in the world continued to inspire new generations. Mrs. Margaret, now nationally recognized for her work, never forgot the lessons she learned. That true love never dies, it only multiplies. That sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as challenges, and that a faithful dog can be the best teacher of unconditional love anyone could ever have. And every night, when the shelter's lights came on and the dog settled down to sleep, Mrs. Margaret would look at the window that had once stayed closed for 10 years and smile, knowing Timmy and Duke were at peace, seeing how their dream had become a reality even more beautiful than they could have imagined. The end of the story. What an incredible journey of love and perseverance, don't you think? Tell me in the comments, do you believe animals can sense our emotions and help us heal past wounds? Which part of the story touched your heart the most? Leave a like if this story moved you as much as it moved me to tell it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories. Your opinion means a lot to us.